Well, let's go live now to our guest, Martin Jay, who is a Beirut-based British journalist. Martin, good to see you. Thanks for joining us this morning. So, we've been constantly hearing about boosting of security measures across Europe and recently, and it seems like its biggest cities, like the UK, France and Germany, are still on high alert, and attacks keep on happening. And a lot of people waking up to this news this morning will be probably angrily asking, why does Europe remain so vulnerable?
Yeah, there's a real crisis, isn't there, both on an EU level and on a national level for many EU member states. I mean, when we talk about security and data sharing, intelligence sharing and border security, the European Union is way behind. It just doesn't have, it can't get the agreement on member state level with so many of these various drafts that are currently going through the Brussels mill, and tragically, these sort of attacks are inevitable. If you look just at the Paris attack, that was another good example of EU rules failing. The actual Paris attacker arrived and crossed an EU border, was scrutinised by EU border security officials who even identified they had a fake Syrian ID, but ultimately let him in after a week in custody. A similar tragic story was with in Brussels, whereas one of the Brussels bombers travelled to the Syrian border, the Syrian-Turkish border, tried to get in across and join Daesh, was turned back by the Turkish authorities, who informed the Belgian government, the Belgian police, what this individual tried to do, but the Belgians did nothing about it. They couldn't. They didn't have the jurisdiction to arrest him. So a lot of problems. Very sadly, the Manchester attack, which is one of the worst since the 2005 bombing in London, is just throwing light on that very issue.
Thinking about the UK in particular, terrorists seem to pick symbolic places to carry out atrocities, very high-profile locations, for instance, like Parliament in March, or a teen concert now in Manchester, where a lot of children and young parents would be. Do you think this is done on purpose as a kind of challenge to the security forces, or a provocation?
Oh, I don't think there's any doubt about that. I think it's designed. There's a sick, twisted ideology behind these attacks, which, and part of that way of thinking is to get the maximum public relations impact. You know, and one of the things I've been writing about for a long time and campaigning for is that Western governments and Western media really should stop completely giving oxygen to ISIS on social media and internet. But also, you know, when you think about how these groups spread their perverted ideology, you know, a big part of it is through press coverage. And I think the bomber in this case, was naturally inspired by probably other attacks in very concentrated areas, not just to get the maximum impact to kill, but also that's what draws Western media to splash the story across the screens and to dominate television screens.
Now, we've heard from the EU Commission Chief, Jean-Claude Juncker. He's claimed that tomorrow Europe will fight back. Let's just remind ourselves and take a listen.
Today, we mourn with you. Tomorrow, we will work side by side with you to fight back against those who seek to destroy our way of life.
So what do you think, Martin? Is it just a figure of speech, or are we actually going to see some concrete action here?
Oh, yeah, words fail me. I mean, this is the same Jean-Claude Juncker, who was the president of the European Commission, who just months ago offered jihadist group in Syria hundreds of millions of dollars of cash if they would stop fighting. I mean, you know, it's just disgusting, frankly, that any rhetoric like that can come from the European Union when the European Union is actually part of the problem in the first place. You know, the European Union's foreign policy right across the Middle East and Africa supports so many despots. It encourages appalling human rights conditions in many of these countries. And as a consequence of that, you have immigration problems in Europe, which people congregate in countries like Libya before they cross into the European Union. And we have to have a much more intelligent approach. I mean, Jean-Claude Juncker is blithely ignorant of what's going on in Syria, just as Donald Trump is. You know, we need a much more intelligent, joined-up approach to understanding terrorism and what Daesh or ISIL really is in these countries before we can make stupid comments like that. That's the last thing we really need. Is the EU now is to step in and start messing around in areas that they have absolutely no understanding or no experience of whatsoever. Trump's message over the last couple of days was deeply worrying. he seemed to completely simplify the situation in the Middle East, doesn't really understand, doesn't want to understand what Daesh is, what ISIS is, doesn't really want to understand that a big part of what today's incident, last night's incident in Manchester, is linked to a twisted, perverted Salafist ideology which comes from Saudi Arabia, the very country that we want to improve relations with while demonizing Iran. So I think Jean-Claude Juncker should just shut up and not really make such statements. He's not doing anyone any favours. And as I said, I think the EU is part of the problem.
And speaking of Trump, we are going to listen to some of his latest comments on this Manchester attack in just a moment. But it must become a kind of standard procedure. We've seen a number of European leaders express their condolences, adding that they should continue to work together to fight terror after the attack in Manchester. But we keep seeing attack after attack. Do you think Europe is taking any effective measures? Are they working, any of these measures they're taking?
No, they're not, and we're not really seeing any coherent plan. I mean, that's really the important thing. There is a draft at the moment, a legislative draft in Brussels for the idea of much more intelligence sharing. But intelligence sharing doesn't really work on a high level. When you implement those sort of plans, you only get low-level intelligence anyway. We need to. Europe and the West need to completely rethink what's going on in Syria and Iraq right now, what the Americans and what the America's allies are doing in the region. We need a different approach from Western media, which is sloppy. It doesn't really understand the facts on the ground. We need a complete radical overhaul. That could start at a government level if you wanted it to. But what we're doing in what the Americans are doing right now in Mosul. For example, why are we bombing hundreds of innocent women and children, which in fact feeds the terrorist machine? Those people who've seen horrors in front of their very eyes and lost close family members, end up joining these terrorist organizations. So to go back to your question about what these countries need to do, we need an entirely new mindset which counters what Mr. Trump espoused over the weekend.
OK, Martin J., Beirut-based British journalist. Do stay with us on the line if you have the time. I'd love to come back to you in just a moment to get your thoughts on some latest developments. Thank you very much for this. OK, the US president has expressed his condolences to the victims and families affected by the atrocity in Manchester, calling terrorists, quote, evil losers. Donald Trump made the statement at the beginning of a joint press conference with the Palestinian president, Mahmoud Abbas.
I extend my deepest condolences to those so terribly injured in this terrorist attack, and to the many killed and the families, so many families, of the victims. We stand in absolute solidarity with the people of the United Kingdom. So many young, beautiful, innocent people living and enjoying their lives murdered by evil losers in life. I won't call them monsters because they would like that term. They would think that's a great name. I will call them from now on losers because that's what they are. They're losers. And we'll have more of them. But they're losers. Just remember that.
OK, let's go back to Martin J. now, a Beirut-based British journalist. I do apologise. OK, Martin, so according to Donald Trump, the US president, the attackers are losers. What's your reaction to Trump's statements?
Yeah, but it's just a simplistic overview of a situation which is far, far, far more complicated. And I think Trump doesn't understand. He just doesn't understand the way that America is going, which is to oversimplify the Middle East, to demonize Iran, when Iran, to be fair to Iran, and Hezbollah, its proxy, have done a lot of the fighting, a lot of the close-hand fighting with ISIS in recent years in Syria and in Iraq. For Trump to take that to go to the next level now recently and to galvanize this relationship with Gulf Arab countries, with Saudi Arabia leading the charge, we're going to see a lot more of this, and we're going to see a lot more losers, as Donald Trump calls them. these lone wolf bombers. You know, I mean, they're hiding and waiting, and they're ready to come out at any moment once they've given the auspices the correct moment to fulfill whatever they think they're carrying out. But these losers, unfortunately, come from an ideology. They come from a massive, wholesale, ignorant Western idea of the Middle East, where we have Trump's people who simply don't understand the nuances of the Middle East and what's going on in Syria and Iraq. So in one respect, we have a lot more responsibility on our side for these losers.
OK, Martin, it's always great to get your thoughts on things. Thank you for joining us on RT International. That's Martin Jay, a Beirut-based British journalist. Thanks again. Europe remains so vulnerable.
Yeah, there's a real crisis, isn't there, both on an EU level and on a national level for many EU member states. I mean, when we talk about security...
And recently, and it seems like its biggest cities, like the UK, France and Germany, are still on high alert, and attacks keep on happening. And a lot of people waking up to this news this morning will be probably angrily asking, why does Europe... Well, let's go live now to our guest, Martin Jay, who is a Beirut-based British journalist. Martin, good to see you. Thanks for joining us this morning. So, we've been constantly hearing about boosting of security measures across Europe.
And data sharing, intelligence sharing, and border security. The European Union is way behind. It just doesn't have, it can't get the agreement on member state level with so many of these various drafts that are currently going through the Brussels mill. And tragically, these sort of attacks are inevitable. If you look just at the Paris attack, that was another good example of EU rules failing. The actual Paris attacker arrived and crossed an EU border, was scrutinized